Okay, thank you for joining our Metalogix quick take on explaining the Business Administrators group and the required permissions for that group. If you, for whatever reason, have to leave this meeting early or come in late, we will be recording this meeting and posting it on the Metalogix product knowledge base on metalogix.com. And of course, as I mentioned before, you have the ability to ask any questions. For anybody who is on the live meeting, there should be a question panel in the webinar, and we will address those questions towards the end of the meeting. My name is Paul McNally. I'm one of the senior support representatives for the ControlPoint toolset. I've done a few of these quick takes before now, so if you're on this meeting, you may have seen me on one of the previous meetings, or you may have met with me directly on one of our cases. Today we're going to be talking about the Business Administrators group, and we're going to be covering a few things. There's not a lot to put in the agenda because most of it's just going to be hands-on with the actual ControlPoint application. We're going to talk about the different security groups that ControlPoint creates when it's first installed. We're going to talk about some of the requirements for a business administrator, permissions requirements to see sites within the SharePoint hierarchy in ControlPoint, and the requirement of the discovery process to be running. And we'll cover some of the discovery best practices briefly. There are actually a couple of other quick takes that deal with discovery best practices and some of the permissions required and tweaking that process. We'd actually recommend taking a look at those for some additional information on the discovery process. So I'm going to switch my screen over to an installation of ControlPoint here on one of our internal support test environments. This is ControlPoint for SharePoint 2013. And you can see that from the fact that we have this SharePoint summary graph available. If you're using SharePoint 2010 or 2007, you may not have these graphs or information about your farm available directly on the splash page, but that will be rolled out to the other versions in a future release of the product. I also have the actual root ControlPoint configuration site open. This is the SharePoint site that ControlPoint sits on top of. You're probably already familiar with that. And we're going to talk about some of the permissions that are actually created by the ControlPoint application when we first install and create this web application and site collection. I'm going to navigate over to the Site Settings menu for this site. And once this loads up, we'll go over to our people and groups. Or actually more specifically, let's go to Site Permissions just so we can have a bigger view of the options that are available. As you can see, we have a few different groups that were created here, a couple that we've actually created to test some other behavior, and a couple of users that are explicitly put into this environment. But ControlPoint creates 4 groups when it's initially installed. We create the ControlPoint Application Administrators group. This is the group for any users that will actually be managing the ControlPoint application, adding other users, modifying ControlPoint's default settings. And as you can see, this group has full control to this site collection. The other 3 groups that we create are administrators, business administrators, and remote service account administrators. These groups all have read access to the ControlPoint site and are all used for some pretty specific things. Remote service account administrator specifically is only used if you have a multi-farm environment set up and you're attempting to perform actions cross-farm, like a cross-farm copy of a site or a list. You would have to put the service account for any other installations of ControlPoint in that group. But today we're more going to cover this business administrators group. It's a read access group to the ControlPoint configuration site that exists specifically to give end users that aren't necessarily site collection administrators rights to perform actions or reports on sites in ControlPoint that they have full control. If I'm a member of the ControlPoint application administrators group, for instance, I'm logged in right now as my service account for this support environment. In that group, in order to actually expand out these web applications and see the site collections that we have under them, I need to either be a site collection administrator to each of these site collections, or I need to have full control at the web application user policy. In our experience and the conversations we've had with our clients, a lot of people don't necessarily want to give administrative users site collection administrator rights. They don't want them to have the ability, for instance, to delete a site collection. or remove it, or modify some of the auditing settings. But they still want those users to have full control, and they want that full control to allow them to use either the ControlPoint application or some of the features that you can activate on the site collections themselves to let those users run ControlPoint reports. So as opposed to the ControlPoint Application Administrators group, which requires that Site Collection Administrator access or Web Application Full Control access, the Business Administrators group just requires full control at the site level. And in fact, you can actually have full control at a sub-site level, and there's a parameter that you can change called Show All BA Sites that will allow you to run a report on a sub-site even if you don't necessarily have permission to the root site. So I could have this site collection on which I do not have full control. I wouldn't be able to run a report, but I can still expand out any sub-sites under it and run reports on those sub-sites. ControlPoint actually checks whether or not these users have full control to these sites based on the cached permissions data that's collected by the discovery process. So while your site collection administrators, your web application full control users, their security trimming and their ability to see these sites is trimmed out live when you load the ControlPoint application. But a business administrator's security trimming is based on some of that cached data that's collected by the discovery process. So if you want to put users into that business administrators group, you need to remember that the discovery process needs to be running consistently, and that any changes to security that you make will only take effect when a new discovery runs. So if I, for instance, were to add a user to one of these site collections with full control, and that user was in the business administrators group, when I logged into ControlPoint as that user, I wouldn't necessarily have the ability to just expand out this project's web application and see that site. The discovery process has to run. Now that doesn't necessarily need to be a full discovery, because in this case the permissions data is cached into our XCadmin service database when the discovery runs on that site. So for instance, if I wanted to add a user to this Alpha Team project site, and I wanted them to be able to immediately access that site through ControlPoint, what I could do is navigate to my Manage tab here, go over to my Discovery option, and once this loads up, I'll actually modify the selection for discovery so that instead of running a full farm discovery, I'll just run it against that one site collection or that web application. In this case, I apply that. I'm just running discovery against the site collection, and I can choose to run now, and discovery will complete much more quickly against a single site than it would against your entire farm. So that's something to keep in mind, that if you're modifying business administrator permissions regularly, or you're adding or removing users for full control to the web applications, then you may want to run a discovery against a smaller scope just live. As you can see, this only took about 15 seconds to run against this one site collection, and any users that I've added will have the ability to see that site if they're in the business administrators group and they launch ControlPoint. If you have recently installed ControlPoint, you've just installed onto the 5.4 build or our upcoming 6.0 build once it's available, and you didn't have an existing ControlPoint web application, or you weren't previously using ControlPoint, the discovery process may not be enabled by default. If you're coming up from an older version, it was enabled by default in those older versions, and you won't have to enable it. But one thing to keep in mind, if you've done a new installation, you're adding business administrators groups and users, and they don't have the ability to see these sites after they've been added, you may want to just check some of the settings that we have relating to discovery to make sure that they have the right rights and that discovery is consistently running to record those cache permissions. So if I navigate to the ControlPoint settings list here, I'll navigate over to my Discovery Performance category and confirm that the parameter Discovery Enabled is set to True. This allows the discovery process to run nightly. This allows business administrator rights to be cached within the XCadmin service database, and it allows your end users who are business administrators to access the ControlPoint application regularly as long as their cached permissions have been stored by the latest discovery. So we've covered the actual process of granting business user permissions, but I wanted to just talk about one more category of settings that we have here, which is our business administrator's functionality. We've included a few options here that allow your ControlPoint application administrators to trim the ability of business administrator users to do certain actions within ControlPoint. The important one, or actually really more in my opinion the most important one, is going to be this show all BA sites parameter. And we talked about that briefly at the beginning of this quick take. If I'm an end user, I may not have full control at the root site collection level of a deeper site collection. For instance, this site collection here has multiple subsites that may not have unique or inherited permissions. This is a uniquely permissioned subsite. Let's say I'm an end user that has full control to this subsite, but not to the root site. If I was a business administrator and I launched the ControlPoint application, and this was set to false, I would not be able to expand out to this subsite because I wouldn't be able to access the root site because I don't have full control to it. So by setting this to true, business administrators can see the full hierarchy of sites they have access to, even if they're not necessarily the root site. We'll bypass sites that they can't access. They won't be able to run reports in that root level site, but they'll be able to expand out to the sites that they have permission to. The obvious drawback here is that the process of actually confirming rights to all of those subsites may take a little bit longer. And if you have a lot of site collections with a lot of unique permissions, it may take those business users longer to expand out their sites. The other three parameters that we have in this section really deal more with managing the ability of business administrators to do actions that might have an impact on the farm. Specifically, we give the ControlPoint application administrators the ability to restrict whether or not business administrators have the ability to delete permissions, whether or not they have the ability to run real-time reports as opposed to scheduled reports, and whether or not they have the ability to send out emails for a successful scheduled report or a failed scheduled report to end users. The BA prevent delete parameter deals more with deleting user permissions. Setting this to true prevents a user from being able to delete permissions after, say, the orphan domain user report is run. That's the one that they mention in the description of the parameter here. The BA prevent real-time parameter deals with your ability to go into ControlPoint and run an action using the Run Now button. If that's set to true, users will not be able to select Run Now. They'll have to use a schedule to set up a job to run at some later time. That's to make sure that if you have multiple business administrator users, that they're not all trying to run reports in real time during business hours that would impact the performance of your SharePoint environment. And our third option here, BA prevents scheduled email, that just prevents business administrator users from being able to include an email distribution list with their reports. Now this is obviously so if you wanted to send to a large number of users, it's not clogging up any SMTP servers or outgoing email queues. And those basically are just a few options that we made available for end users to be able to kind of manage business administrator users. It's a little bit more helpful if your end users are a large number of business administrators. If you've added site owners to ControlPoint or site collection administrators to ControlPoint, you've added them to the business administrators group, and you want to restrict their impact on the performance of your SharePoint environment or restrict their ability to make changes to your SharePoint environment that have long-lasting consequences. So the key is that any user with that full control level can be added to that business administrator group, and it gives you a way to more granularly give them permission to ControlPoint without having them require the ability to delete the site collection or set site collection level properties that only a site collection administrator can set. So it's just one other way to security trim these users within SharePoint, but allow them to run ControlPoint actions and analyses. One other thing I did want to show is under our ControlPoint configuration here, you have the ability to auto-add users to ControlPoint groups. If you choose, you could use this action to add some of those site collection administrators or full control users to the ControlPoint application administrators or the business administrators group as we discussed. You see I have the ability to add users to chosen group based on these parameters, either a specific permission level, which I haven't defined any custom permissions levels, or site collection administrators or members of the owners group. So in this case, I could set members of the site owners group and add them to the business administrators group. I can modify the selection so it only affects certain site collections or certain web applications to reduce the impact that would have on my SharePoint environment. And I can set this up to enforce a policy, have it run regularly every week to add new users that are added with full control to some of these ControlPoint groups. Users that are added to the owners group can be added to the business administrators group on a regular basis. Remember, though, the one caveat that I always say, if you have too many users in the business administrators group, this can impact the performance of the application, specifically the discovery process. We have to validate business administrator permissions, and while we've made a lot of improvements in the last few builds in our ability to do that, if you're adding 10,000 users or an AD group that contains 10,000 users or something like that, you can see some impacts on the discovery process and find that it takes a little bit longer. We have some best practices associated with the discovery process. We have the ability to run a delta discovery, ignore inherited site permissions. That's not something I'm going to get too deep in during our call today. My colleague Dave Barnett actually had a quick take on optimizing and configuring the discovery process that I can't recommend enough for any client. So it's definitely something to look for. So that covers the part of the quick take where we actually discuss the business administrators group and some of the best practices, but I wanted to make sure we could answer any questions related to this. I don't see any questions that have been asked right now. Obviously, ask any questions you have now. If you think of any questions or run into any issues with implementing this business administrators group, obviously our support team can be contacted. The phone number is 202-609-9100, or you can open a ticket or access our customer portal through the Metalogics.com website. So I'll just mute myself for a moment and allow any questions that need to come in. I actually see a couple of people in the chat have asked if there is ongoing documentation about the Business Administrators Group and its requirements. Absolutely. Let me go ahead and I've opened up the Metalogics.com site here. If I navigate to support, I'll just select this just to show you as an aside here the different ways that we have available to contact our support team, the phone number, our customer portal, our online options. And I wanted to show some of the resources we had available here, specifically our product downloads and resources. I'll navigate to my ControlPoint documentation. And specifically, I would take a look at the ControlPoint administration guide for details about the business administrators group and how to add users to the ControlPoint groups, or the ControlPoint user guide for some more specifics about the reports that are available. We also have the Metalogics knowledge base. Our quick take, as well as all of the older quick takes, will all be updated to that knowledge base, along with a number of articles, documentation pieces, additional information that other clients have dealt with ControlPoint. It's a great resource if you need some additional information. But, of course, our support team's also always here for any questions that you have. Somebody did ask which version of ControlPoint we were using here. I'll flip over back to our ControlPoint build. This is the 5.4 build for SharePoint 2013 specifically. I noticed some people were asking specifically about the SharePoint summary graphs that we have available on our splash page here. These are only available right now in the SharePoint 2013 version. This is the 5.4 build, the newest build we have available. We will be releasing a 6.0 build with some additional functionality that we'll be able to cover in a future quick take. That right now will be released shortly. I obviously can't give a specific day because that can change, but they're putting the finishing touches on it well as we speak. So, as I mentioned, if anybody has joined late or they missed part of that for any reason, this meeting has been recorded. We'll actually be posting it on our knowledge base for on-demand viewing. Obviously, you can't ask questions if you're watching it on demand, but our support team obviously always available to answer any of those. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Like I said, any further questions, any further concerns, feel free to contact us. We'd be happy to follow up with you as needed, make sure that these groups are operating correctly and that any follow-up questions you have been addressed. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great day.